And good morning, everyone. Today is September 10th. Let's go ahead and get started. When we last left off, we had been talking about the Great Awakening, if I remember, and we didn't talk about it all that much. It is a topic that we could get into more detail on, but we're going to move forward. What we need to know is that by roughly the mid-18th century, the mid-1700s, the English colonies are very effectively moving west. Their population has grown considerably. Of the 1.3 million inhabitants of North America in the colonial states at this time, most of them are English. And both the English and the French understand that sooner or later, there's going to have to be an understanding as to who owns what, that the borders, particularly in the West, are going to have to be better defined. Both of them understand, both England and France understand that Spain is declining. Now, they don't know how long Spain will hold on to its colonial possessions. They don't know what that's all about. But by about 1750, they both understand that Spain is clearly the sick man out here, and that these colonies and this colonial system is likely to not last that much longer. Both of them also understand, and I'm showing over here on the screen, that the land to the west of the Appalachians, what we would call the Ohio River Valley and the other river valleys out there, ultimately leading to the Mississippi, this is incredibly fertile, incredibly valuable. There are going to be enormous opportunities to create farms and grow crops, quite likely moving them down these river systems out of New Orleans. This is in demand. And the English and the French both have their eyes on it. Now, the French understand acutely that they are at a disadvantage. The French understand that in terms of the numbers, the English are far better off. Now, back in Europe, France is a very powerful nation. France and England are certainly rivals over in Europe. But in the New World, the English colonies are gaining a foothold that the French simply don't have. And it all just gets right back down to the fact that farther north, there's not a lot of population growth. Families cannot thrive and grow crops in the St. Lawrence region. And so the French are particularly interested in the Ohio River Valley. The French really see the Ohio River Valley as the key to them being able to hang on to their colonial power. The French have begun to build forts out west. They've built forts all along the river systems as a way of planting their flag and asserting their claim to this territory. Now, keep in mind, the French have claimed this territory since La Salle sailed down the Mississippi in 1682. That doesn't mean that claim is necessarily respected. What really matters is they have to be able to enforce that claim. They have to be able to not just plant the flag, but defend that territory. So things are about to get really complicated. There is also, of course, this tremendous demand by the English settlers to cross those mountains and move into the Ohio River Valley. Over in Europe, there are other factors that are leading to stress between the French and the English. On the continent itself, there are realignments of alliances. The growth of Prussia, for example, is changing how the continent does business. But also India, South Asia, is another flashpoint between the French and the English. India is a subcontinent to itself. It is incredibly rich in resources, and both England and France have designs on colonizing there. And so who exactly is going to get India? Who exactly is going to get North America? What is the future of Europe really going to look like among the great powers? It's a big issue in the middle of the 18th century. We, of course, understand that they're not going to resolve these conflicts peacefully, are they? We know that at the end of the day, North America and India are going to be decided through combat, through warfare. Everybody can understand that some sort of clash is coming. Everybody knows. So, in 1754, the British held a conference in Albany, which is the far western section of New York, way out on the frontier at the time. And they invited the Indians to come in and proposed a military alliance. And specifically, they were trying to recruit the Iroquois. Oops. They were recruiting the Iroquois. The Iroquois at this time are still quite powerful out there, still quite well established. And the English make a lot of promises to them, because they realize if it comes to blows with the French, having these people to do our fighting for us would be to our advantage. And the Albany Conference represented the British recognizing that they've got to find a way to make friends with the Indians. Well, the Iroquois rejected them. The Iroquois didn't take the deal. The natives do not like the English. They do not trust the English. We already know why. Another problem that's going to emerge for the English colonies is the fact that they don't necessarily get along with each other. Each of these colonies is governed separately. Each of these colonies has its own leadership, its own economic structure, and of course its own interests. And so in the event that a war breaks out with the French, these colonies might not necessarily work well together. Now you think to yourself, well, why wouldn't they? Why would there be a problem? Obviously, we're all on the same team here, and we all have the same goals. But keep in mind, for example, if you are Virginia and you know that a war is going to take place, you know that there's going to be fighting with French and there's fighting with Indians. And then New York gets in touch with you and says, we need a lot of soldiers up here because the war isn't going too good for us. What's going to happen if all of your young men go to New York to help them out? That leaves your colony undefended, doesn't it? And so you're going to maybe tell the New Yorkers, we'd love to help you. We're all friends here, but we need to stay here. Also, there is the issue of who would pay for it, right? If we're going to go up there and fight for you New Yorkers, who exactly is going to foot the bill? Where are the weapons going to come from, right? Where are the uniforms going to come from? What's in it for us if we are to do that? And so there's a lot of questions in terms of how these colonies are connected to each other, and it really has never been resolved. Each colony has been sort of in charge of its own military apparatus up to this point. Well, let's just go ahead and get the party started. What we know is that war did break out on the frontier between the English and the French in 1754. War did break out between the English and the French in 1754, and this is a conflict that will come to be called the French and Indian War. And the reason it's called the French and Indian War is because that's who we, the English, are fighting. We are fighting the French and the Indians, and so it's the French and Indian War. Two years later, war erupts on the European continent and in India, and globally this will simply be called the 7 Years' War. But it is all part of the same big conflict. It is in many respects the First World War. It is the first global conflict because it is fought in North America, it is fought in Europe, it is fought in South Asia, it is fought on the high seas, it's kind of fought everywhere. Now, there are three theaters. There are three theaters to this war. There are three theaters to this war that we need to look at. Theater 1 is the Atlantic coast. The navies of Britain and France are going to fight it out in the waters off of North America. And the reason why this is so significant is because the only way to supply their soldiers with goods from Europe is through the water. And so whoever can control the Atlantic Ocean is going to have an enormous advantage in this war. And both sides understand this. And so the navies fight it out very aggressively on the Atlantic coast. A second theater of war is the upper New York region. Near Albany, where there are a number of French forts, but the English want to go take them over. That sort of upper New York region, near Montreal, near Quebec. But of course, the big prize is the Ohio River Valley, and that's the third theater, much farther to the south. That land over the Appalachians, where all of that farmland is going to be developed. Well, realizing that this is a global conflict, no cell phones, please. Realizing that this is going to be a global conflict, realizing that we are fighting the French everywhere, the English come up with a comprehensive plan for winning. This can't just be a war where we win in one place. We kind of have to win everywhere. And this plan, as you can imagine, is going to involve telling the colonists in North America to win the war themselves. The initial plan was the people of North America can defeat the French there. We will take on the French in Europe and take on the French in India, and we can win that way. And it turned out to be a disaster. It turned out to be a disaster. The English colonists were woefully ill-equipped to fight the French under these circumstances. They did not have proper weapons. They did not have proper training. The English colonists as soldiers, for the most part, were just a bunch of farmers and militiamen, and they were going up against well-fortified French positions and, of course, the professional French army. And so the first couple of years of the war were not good, at least for the English. The biggest problem, to tell you the truth, was the lack of military officers. There just weren't any in the colonies. Very, very few. Very, very few. The British Army really didn't have much of a presence in the colonies up to this point, and the British Army was very reluctant up to this point to allow English colonists to become officers. You know, if you were an English colonist and you were talented and you wanted to join the regular British Army and you wanted to become an officer, the English government was not too thrilled about that. Now, why do you think up to this point the English government wasn't too thrilled about allowing colonists to become officers? Number one, you didn't grow up in England, so you're not really English. You know, you're sort of English, but you're an American. You're less than us. There's definitely them looking down. It was also, of course, the idea that they don't want the colonists to have their own officers. What happens if a conflict ever comes up between us and them, right? The last thing we want is a group of well-trained colonists that are capable of raising armies and leading men. You know, the army business is supposed to be left to the mother country. And so allowing colonists to become officers is kind of like giving guns to the slaves, right? There's a reason why we don't give guns to the slaves. One man who did have a degree of experience as a militia officer, but not as a British regular officer, was Colonel George Washington. You might have heard of him. And he had actually tried to become a British regular. He had applied to join the British military and receive officer training, and he had actually been rejected, even though he was a very talented young man. Again, there was a reluctance there. But he did have experience as a militia officer, and he did lead an attack on a French fort along the Monongahela River. He did lead an attack on a French fort along the Monongahela River. It was a disaster. It didn't work. He did everything wrong, and his men were not capable of getting the job done. And it was humiliating to Colonel Washington, and many believed that that was it for him. His career's over. This was such an embarrassment that there was really nothing else for him in the future. But this was repeated. All these French forts that had been built on the frontier, one after another was attacked, one after another repulsed the colonists. And of course, the Indians, the natives, with French support, began tearing up the English countryside. The French now start giving all kinds of weapons to these Indians, all kinds of support, and they tell these natives, go to town. And so the English countryside, just in Virginia, the Carolinas, New York, you name it, all kinds of attacks and massacres started taking place. These Indians were just looking for an opportunity to start pushing back, as you can imagine. And so it was bad. It was ugly. It was ugly, very tragic. And the more disoriented this campaign became, the less likely the colonies were to cooperate with each other. If you are Virginia now, you sure as heck aren't sending anybody to go help those folks in New York, because you know the Indians are attacking on your frontier. You're doing everything possible to stop your own settlers from getting slaughtered. In 1758, with the war in North America just on the verge of collapse, England gets a new prime minister, a man by the name of William Pitt. England gets a new prime minister. And he was not going to let this war be lost. He made it clear to Parliament that he intended to see any amount spent, any step taken to make sure that the French are defeated. And of course, those Americans are utterly incompetent, and they clearly cannot win this war on their own. With Parliament's approval, England sent 20,000 British regulars, real soldiers who really know how to fight, along with tremendous amounts of arms and equipment, cannons, gunpowder, you name it, to get the job done that the Americans are clearly incapable of doing. This worked. Almost immediately, when the British regulars show up, the tide begins to turn. Because not only do these British regulars start teaching the Americans how to really fight, and they start giving Americans quality weapons, but of course the British regulars are themselves, man for man, incredibly skilled soldiers. By 1759, French forts along the frontier are falling left and right. The Indians are being pushed back. Progress is being made. This was such an effective turn that in the summer of 1759, the British actually invaded Quebec. Not only were they able to take over the frontier, but they started to take over the established French territory. A key part of this was the British Navy. A key part of this was the British Navy. The British now have generations of experience with logistics. And they knew how to get lots of stuff to the Americas, but they also knew how to fight the French on the open seas. They also knew how to fight the French on the open seas. The British Navy was just considerably more effective. And so they were able to blockade the French and stop them from resupplying their armies. The war itself was over by about 1761. The war itself was over by about 1761. The official treaty ending the war was in 1763, and it is the Treaty of Paris. It is the Treaty of Paris. Now, this is what we need to know with this treaty. In very simple terms, when you win the war, what do you take? All of it. That's what you take. When you're the winner, you get it all. And that's exactly what the British did. The Treaty of Paris gave the British everything east of the Mississippi River. Now, Spain had been an ally of Britain during the war, and so Spain received the land west of the Mississippi River. And that was as a reward for that alliance. Spain also received New Orleans. Spain also received New Orleans. But now North America is firmly in the hands of the English. The French colonies are now English colonies, although they don't quit speaking French. Also, of course, in South Asia, the British take all of India, all of it. The French are now permanently gone, and India will become a British colony. The French are humiliated. This threatens France's very ability to remain a great power in Europe because so much of its colonial land was taken away. France no longer has a colonial presence to speak of after this. This is the line that now defines Britain as a global superpower. Britain can now sort of assume that title once it has half of North America and all of South Asia. The British Empire has now reached a point where it is unrivaled on the planet. And Britain will go on to build on this. And in the 19th century, Britain continues to do this. In the year 1900, at the beginning of the 20th century, 25% of the Earth's surface was British. That's how big the British Empire was. The largest empire ever created. The phrase was that the sun never sets on the British Empire because something is always in the daytime. What had truly been the winning institution and what would be the glue that holds it together is the British Navy. Britain will go on to build the most powerful navy humans had ever created. And the Navy is designed to glue the empire together, to link up all of these different colonial possessions, to protect all of the merchant ships. The British East India Company will continue to thrive, sort of. We've got to mention that one here in a minute. Britain will construct new warships like the one you see here, the HMS Victory, that are substantially more powerful than anything that had been created before. You know, ships that are capable of just annihilating anything that gets in their way. You know, the HMS Victory was simply designed to be so imposing that people were simply too scared to engage it to begin with. And this is known as a ship of the line, and Britain built an entire fleet of them with the entire intention of scaring people into submission. You do not want to get into a fight with ships like this. And when Napoleon tried in 1804, he learned very quickly that it was a bad idea. That would be the Battle of Trafalgar. So hooray for us. And of course, what does this mean for the American people? Well, it means we're going to get it all, right? All of that land in the Ohio River Valley is now ours to settle. We will have all of the benefits of trade with the British Empire. We were doing good before. This opens the door for an era of prosperity that we couldn't have even imagined before this happened. Well, not quite. There's always going to be a fly in the ointment, isn't there? Well, in this case, there's two. First of all, the British government did not open up the land west of the Appalachians. Even though we know this is going to happen, in 1763, with the Treaty of Paris, the Crown still said no, not yet. There was a promise that soon settlement would be permitted, but not yet. And that frustrated a lot of colonists. They thought that surely they would be allowed to settle this new land, but we're not going to do that quite yet. And the fear was conflict with the natives. The fear was more Indian fighting. But the real bug in the ointment is the fact that this war had been very, very expensive. This was not a cheap conflict. We have to remind ourselves, the Americans were losing this war until the British started pouring all of the money and the resources into winning it. And paying for it was not going to be easy. Paying for it was not going to be easy. Now, I want to have a little discussion over exactly how we pay for things like this and exactly how the colonial system worked at the time, because you have to understand this in order to understand the real issues on the ground. Governments can raise money by taxing people, right? That's how governments pay their bills, right? We issue taxes and everybody pays their taxes and there we go. But what happens, excuse me, what happens if a government needs a big old chunk of money right now and obviously issuing a gigantic tax is not realistic? What if we need to get a big old chunk of money to, build a building or fight a war or something like that? Instead of taxing, what can the government do? The government can borrow it, exactly. The government can issue what is known as a bond, okay? And a bond is nothing more than an IOU, okay? If you want to loan the government money, you can go down, you can loan the government whatever, and you will receive a certificate that you can then redeem in the future for interest. The government can borrow money from the people, and that's simply called a bond issue. Federal governments do it, state governments do it, local governments do it, government bonds. Government bonds are generally considered very secure forms of investment because the government is going to do everything possible to pay it back. If the government doesn't pay back its bond, nobody will ever loan money to the government again. Bonds typically don't come with a very high interest rate. Well, to pay for the French and Indian War, the British government issued an awful lot of bonds. The British government borrowed money from lots of people. Lots of bond debt was taken out. Well, after a few years, this bond debt starts coming due, doesn't it? Now, if we issue a 5-year bond in 1758, that means in 1763, those people are going to show back up with their bonds and say, give me my money back and my interest, right? And 5-year bonds are kind of common. 10-year bonds are common. 20-year bonds are common. In fact, the British government was willing to borrow so much money at any cost that it even issued perpetual bonds. Bonds that you can collect on forever, as long as the empire exists. And there are still people today that hold perpetual bonds dating back to the French and Indian War. I'm not making that up. Not many, and it's not much money, but still. So in 1763, when the Treaty of Paris is signed, everybody is happy. We've created a global empire. Now, we got to pay the bill. Now we got to pay the bill. And we cannot default on those bonds. When the bondholders show up and say, 5 years ago, you loaned us money, we loaned you money, and now we want it back with interest, British government's going to have to cough up that money. And because many of these bonds were issued for the North American part of the conflict, people start to scratch their head and say, shouldn't those Americans play a role in paying some of this back? They are the ones that will benefit from all of this land. They are the ones that were not capable of winning the war after all. Now, this is where the philosophy behind the colonial system starts to break down. Colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. We've talked about that before. And up to this point, colonists in the English colonies have paid 0 taxes. They have existed tax-free. Sounds like a pretty good deal. But I will remind you, they also don't have the freedom to choose their own government. They don't have the freedom to make their own laws. They are an investment by the crown. They are an investment by the crown. Well, Britain gets a new Chancellor of the Exchequer. And his name is George Grenville. And Grenville is looking at the books. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is the money man. He's the head of the royal treasury. And Grenville is looking at the numbers, and he's looking at the books, and he's looking at the bonds that are going to have to be paid, and the amount of money collected at home in taxes. And he says, we can't afford this. And Grenville concludes that the colonists are going to have to start paying taxes. Grenville concludes that there is no two ways about it. The colonists have to start paying taxes. They have never had to pay them up to this point. They have never had to pay them up to this point. Now follow me on this. Follow me on this. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that emerges about the year 1700 that saw the birth of political science, modern history, modern sociology, modern social sciences as we understand it. Enlightenment thinkers embraced logic and reason, and much of the intellectual thought in the 18th century revolved around this sort of revolutionary new set of ideas. One of the Enlightenment thinkers is the father of political science, and his name was Montesquieu. He was French. He was Montesquieu. He was French. And Montesquieu studied how governments in Europe were structured. Montesquieu studied how governments in Europe were structured. And he came to discover, or came to assert, that there are, in fact, three separate types of government across the Western world. There are republics, which are states that are governed by a parliament or governed by a legislative body. Some of them have monarchs, but the monarchs hold no real power. The monarchs are basically figureheads. Now, I'm using different terms than him. There are constitutional monarchies, where there is a king that executes the law and is sort of the CEO, and then there is a parliament that makes the law and sets rules for the kings to follow. And then there are absolute monarchies. Now again, I'm using different terms than him. And these are states where the king is all powerful. He makes the law. He executes the law. If he says this is what it is, it's what it is. These are states like Russia with the czars, the Ottoman Empire with the sultans. France, of course, is an absolute monarchy. And Montesquieu is interested in figuring out which one of these works the best. Montesquieu is interested in figuring out which one of these works the best. And he finally concludes that most nations should be constitutional monarchies. Most nations should be a state where there is a king that is in charge that runs the show, but there is a parliament that gives him the rules that he is to follow. And this is the British government. This is how England and Britain work. And England and Britain are a little different, but we're not going to go there right now. And Montesquieu is so interested in this that he creates a blueprint for how he thinks a government should be structured. You know, this is a man of logic and reason, and says, let's just sit down and design a government from the ground up. And he models it, of course, on the English system, even though he's French. And he argues that there should be a king, which governs what he calls the executive branch. And he argues there should be a parliament, which of course is the legislative branch. It's the legislature. And then he argues there should be a judicial branch, the courts. And the judicial branch is not about criminal justice. It's about interpreting what the law would say. It's about interpreting what the law would say or what the law would mean. Kind of think of how this class currently works. Who's in charge of this class? Well, I am, right? Now, does this mean I can do anything I want? I think we're going to stay an extra 30 minutes today and, let's not talk about American history anymore. Do I just get to decide anything? Obviously not, right? There's rules I got to follow, right? So what happens here is I'm in charge of running the class, but there are rules that have been given to me by the college that I follow. So I am the executive of the class, but I don't necessarily set the rules. You get where I'm coming from. And the only rules that I do set are those that I'm authorized to set. You see, I'm not an absolute dictator of this class. I'm the boss based on rules. You get it. Well, this is the English system that we live under. This is the English system that we live under, at least at the time of the colonies. There is another thinker, a man by the name of John Locke, and he was an Englishman. And John Locke argued that the power to govern, the authority to govern, should come from the people. And this is also now established in English tradition. The power to govern should come from the people. Meaning, Parliament is in charge because the people of England have given Parliament authority. The king is the king because the people of England permit him to be the king. And of course, if the people of England want to get rid of the king, they can, can't they? If Parliament wants to abolish the monarchy altogether, Parliament is authorized to do so, as long as it's peaceful. Now, of course, if we head over to France or we head over to Russia and we say, okay, who made you czar? The czar is going to say, God made me czar. The people don't give me any power. I tell them what to do. But not in the English system. And John Locke said that this is very important, and that if the government is not doing its job properly, if the government is not effective, the people have a right to peacefully change it. The people can come together and peacefully govern themselves. So if we don't like the government, we are authorized to put a new one in place. Now, why is this important to George Grenville? And why is it important to taxation? Well, one of the most established rules within the English system, and it is now written in law, it was custom for a long time, but since 1689, it was in law, is that Parliament cannot raise taxes, the king cannot raise taxes without Parliament's permission. The king cannot raise taxes without Parliament's permission. And that is because Parliament represents the people, and the people consent to taxing themselves. Now, in France, of course, King Louis can raise whatever taxes he wants whenever he wants, because God gives him his power, not the people. If the Russian czar, he wants to raise taxes, well, he just snaps his fingers and he just did. But not in England. Under our system, Parliament raises taxes and Parliament speaks for the people. So, George Grenville decides it's time for the Americans to finally start paying taxes. The Americans are citizens of the empire. The Americans are subject, of course, to the laws of the crown. The Americans are subject to the protection of the crown. So it is time for the Americans to start pitching in. So knowing the system that we have in place, what do the Americans then turn around and say, okay, if we're going to have to pay taxes, what do we get? We get representation in Parliament. The king cannot raise taxes without the approval of Parliament. And if we are not sitting in Parliament, we can't approve to be taxed, can we? The king can't raise taxes on us without our approval. If we're not in Parliament, we aren't consenting to these taxes. So we got a problem here. We got a problem here. Well, the first tax that was put on the American people was a tax on sugar. The first tax that was put on the American people, a tax on sugar. Sugar is a luxury item. Sugar is expensive. Sugar is really only an upper class purchase. And of course, if you don't want to pay the tax, just don't buy the sugar, right? Easy enough. This was not expected to be particularly controversial, but the American people just howled over it. Absolutely not. We will not pay taxes on this sugar. We will not be taxed without our permission. This is tyranny. The answer is absolutely not. And all types of resistance popped up, which really took the English government by surprise. They didn't really think it would be that big of a deal. The sugar tax was repealed within a year, but a new tax was put in known as the stamp tax. Now, the stamp tax was not a tax on postage. The stamp tax was a tax on legal documents. The stamp tax was on legal documents. If you sign a contract, it's only valid if you pay the tax. If you buy a piece of land, the deed is only valid if you pay the tax, etc., etc. Now, I can avoid the sugar tax by just not buying sugar. But of course, everybody signs contracts. Everybody buys land. Everybody does something legally. So you can't get around the stamp tax. You can't get around the stamp tax. So the American public starts demanding representation in Parliament. If we are going to be taxed, and we understand why taxation is necessary, these are smart people, we have to sit in Parliament and consent to our taxation. One of the loud voices at this time was a man named James Otis, who worked real hard to explain why this is a matter of principle. It would be easy to say, shut up, I'll just pay the tax. No big deal, right? It's not that much money anyway. Who cares? But Otis said, absolutely not. Otis said, absolutely not. Now, I want you to think about something real quick. The king at this time is King George III. And he is more of a symbolic leader at this point. He's not actually governing England in any notable way. It's the prime minister that actually has the power, but we use him as the symbol. The English people back home in England cannot have their taxes raised without Parliament approving it, and Parliament speaks for them. It is the constitutional monarchy that the English people are very proud of. We have developed a system where the people are represented and the people matter. Over in Russia, over in France, over in Turkey, they have a dictator that just rules over the people and tells them what to do and tells them what the law is. And if I want to raise taxes, I just did. And this is tyrannical. This is barbaric to the English people. And the colonists would point out that England is a constitutional democracy depending on where you live. Because you see, if I live in London, I am living under this system. But if I live in Boston, the king is a tyrant. The king is an absolute monarch who tells me what to do and raises taxes on me at will, right? So King George is actually two types of king, depending on what part of the empire we're talking about. And the English people do not live under a tyrant. The English people have rejected absolute monarchy more than once throughout their history, and we are not going to accept it today. And the colonists point this out. Nobody in England is going to call for absolutism, yet the colonial people are being forced to live under it if they are being forced to pay taxes without their consent in Parliament. Now, the parliamentary reply is in two ways. Number one, everybody is represented in Parliament. Just because there are no Americans sitting in Parliament doesn't mean that Parliament doesn't have your interests in mind. They called this virtual representation. They called this virtual representation. And an honorable member of Parliament thinks about everybody when he considers legislation. And so you don't have to be from the Americas to represent the Americas. And so all members of the empire are represented in the Parliament. Now, of course, the American people said, well, if that's the case, how about we just fill Parliament with the Americans and they can decide what happens in England? And of course, the argument from London would be that certainly men like George Washington and Ben Franklin and the like, these educated American colonists, would probably make perfectly good members of Parliament. They would fit just fine in it. But the reason why we don't allow colonists to sit in Parliament is because the empire is a heck of a lot more diverse than just the Americas. We also govern India. We also govern a lot of other lands. And if we started opening the door to Parliament to all of these different diverse people, Parliament itself would become dysfunctional. There are 500 different languages in India. I'm not making that up. Many different cultures, many different people with very, very different traditions and histories. And they are not culturally suitable to immediately walk into the English Parliament and start governing, at least in the eyes of the people at the time. And so Parliament can only be a parliament for people of the United Kingdom. England, Scotland, Wales, and we're a little iffy on Scotland anyway. So, no, Parliament will not be open to colonists under any circumstances. And you are part of the empire, so you just have to accept the fact that you're still going to pay taxes. Now we have a rock and a hard place, don't we? We have two ideologies that are simply incompatible. There's no realistic way to compromise. You either allow Americans to sit in Parliament so they can be taxed legally, or you don't tax them at all. There is no middle ground. Boston was really the center of the protest. Boston was really the center of the protest. This is largely because Boston is most affected by these taxes. They do more legal business than anyone else. And of course, Boston is the most literate region, most literate city. The people of New England are much more likely to understand this. They're much more likely to have studied the philosophers and received a formal education. They get it, if you get my meaning. One of the early leaders who just railed against this was Samuel Adams, a merchant in Boston who just would not accept the idea of taxation without representation. Other places, of course, would see the same type of resistance. Virginia had its own assembly called the House of Burgesses. And a man by the name of Patrick Henry gave a speech to the House of Burgesses calling this tyranny and screaming, "Give me liberty or give me death." Meaning, I will die before I agree to live under a tyrant. And the minute I have to pay a tax I don't consent to is the minute I am living under the Tsar, is the minute I am living under the Sultan, and I will not live that way. We are English. Parliament doesn't really know what to do either. They had no idea that the resistance would be this significant. In 1766, the Parliament repealed the stamp tax. Tax collectors were getting mobbed and beat up. It wasn't getting paid. It was more chaotic to try to collect than it was worth it. But now we're going to have to find a solution. And one thing that Parliament is not going to back down on is the ability to govern the colonies on its terms. Colonies exist to benefit the mother country, and that's it. And you guys can complain, and we will listen to you, and we will be polite in English about it. What we're not willing to do is allow ourselves to be bossed around by the colonists, though. We are in charge, you are not. We are the parents, you are the children. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Revenue Acts, which placed taxes on a wide variety of raw materials: glass, paper, tea, wood, stuff like that. It was a whole series of little taxes on lots of things that the colonists use. And exactly as we would expect, protests sort of erupted everywhere. Particularly in the urban areas, we see demonstrations in the streets. There's a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's a degree of infighting among the colonists themselves, because they realize, if we cause too much trouble, that's bad for business. If we cause too much trouble, who knows what's going to happen next? So just pay the stupid tax and quit complaining. Sooner or later, we'll get our way. We can work with Parliament. Eventually, they'll let us in, that sort of thing. In some places, local legislatures met and declared paying the taxes illegal. New York had an assembly that prohibited paying any of the taxes. And so, of course, the Crown immediately dissolved the New York Assembly, declared it invalid. Local militia groups started getting formed with people going around enforcing resistance. If you're willing to pay the tax, well, some local militiamen will have a visit with you and change your mind, if you get my meaning. Boston was the hotbed of resistance. And in Boston, more than any other city, there was just a aggressive attempt to resist any of this imposition of taxation or any other type of control for that matter. Let's think about this for a second. Wrap our heads around what's happening. We can understand the philosophy here. If you're going to tax us, you have to have our consent to do so. And the colonists were saying, we will pay taxes, you just have to put us in Parliament so we can have a vote, so we can have a voice. And of course, they are saying King George is actually two types of king. He is a constitutional monarch for the English people, but he is a tyrant and an absolute monarch for us Americans. Let's think about this for just a second. Let's say we're in Russia, and the Tsar passes a tax, declares a tax, and we don't like it, and we tell the Tsar, no, we're not paying it. You can just stuff it, Tsar. We're not going to follow that arbitrary rule. What's the Tsar going to do? What's his response going to be? Is he going to say, okay, you win? What do you do when you try to tell the Tsar what's what in his country? Yeah, he's going to kill you. Okay, he's not going to put up with it. Okay, the Tsar is going to send in his army, and he is going to change your mind very quickly with it. The tyrant uses his powerful military on his own people to enforce his law. The same would be true in France. If you tell King Louis, I'm not paying your taxes, you can shove it, King Louis is going to send in the army, and that army is going to drop the hammer on your community. You are not going to resist the tyrant. It is the military that backs up the tyrant. And that is the case back then, just as much as it is the case today. You look at any tyrannical government in the world, it is the army that backs that guy up. Go to North Korea, right? The North Korean dictator is backed up by the North Korean military. Y'all know that, right? If you look in the news right now, there's protests going on in Belarus. Belarus has a dictator that has been in charge for a long time. He's pretty corrupt. He's pretty brutal. And as these protests are going on, we're seeing the military show up in the cities and start cracking heads in these crowds and these protests. Well, again, we English don't do that. The English are not living under a tyrant. We will not allow ourselves to. But now that we have started pushing back on these taxes, sure enough, as expected, British regulars start showing up in American cities. Boston, New York, Annapolis, Philadelphia. We start seeing regular British soldiers patrolling the streets of American cities. Now, of course, if you go to these soldiers and say, what are you doing here? There's not a war going on. What they will say is, well, there's protests and there's disorder and there's rioting and there's people getting mobbed and beat up and we have to maintain order. But to the people that resist the taxes, what's happening is exactly what the Tsar would do. We are resisting, and now all of a sudden you are sending your soldiers into our community, and the only people that they are going to fire on is us. The only people that they are going to attack are the people who are resisting these arbitrary taxes. And so the king, the crown, is only doing what we expect a tyrant to do. And this infuriates the American people. We don't need British regulars marching through our streets. We don't need them stationed here. So in 1768 and 1769, there's a lot of grumbling about these soldiers. And it seems like more and more of them keep showing up. And they start showing up with things like cannons. What the heck do we need cannons in our cities for? Cannons kill a lot of people. There's only one group of people they could be used on. In March of 1770, in Boston, it was still cold. We are talking about New England here. I probably shouldn't have to tell you this, but the people of Boston like to gather in taverns. They like to drink. They like to have a few more beers than they probably should. And one evening, a group of young Bostonians were walking home from a bar. Now, walking is a generous term. It was more like staggering. And on the corner, they see, the British regulars, a group of about 8 of them, standing duty as they have been seen so many times before. And in different places in the city, there's these little outfits of British regulars that were on guard duty. And you guys have been here for a few years now, and we don't want you here, and we don't like you, and you're not necessary, and we know that you're here to try to force these taxes on us, and why don't y'all all just go home? And that wasn't what these guys were thinking. That's what these guys started saying to the soldiers. Now, British regulars are very, very disciplined. And these soldiers, of course, had been instructed, do not fight with the locals, do not cause problems. You will take orders, and your orders are to be very restrained. And these people are going to be drunk, and they're going to be aggressive, and you are going to do your duty, which is to take it. So these guys, of course, stood there silently, and of course, by not reacting, that only made these fellows want to do a little bit more. And so before you know it, one of them picks up a snowball and just wallops one of them right in the face with a snowball. But, he stands there, He isn't happy, but of course, I'm ordered to stand firm. And so, hey, we can pelt these guys with snowballs and nobody's going to do anything. And so, they start, hammering snowballs at these guys, and they're, but they're doing their duty properly. Of course, sooner or later, the rocks start getting put in the snowballs, right? And before you know it, it's rocks that are being pelted at these guys. But they're not going to attack these drunken Bostonians. Finally, the guy in charge, their commander, orders them to fix bayonets, to point their guns at the crowd. It had become too aggressive. By now, people are showing up and yelling and hurling insults at them. And let's be honest, the minute rocks start getting thrown, we're talking about genuine injury here. You're really hurting somebody when you throw a rock at them. And so everybody at some point does have the right to defend themselves. Before you know it, everything is being screamed and yelled. The redcoats, and they weren't called redcoats at the time, by the way. That was a term that was invented much later. They were called lobsters, and they were called bloody backs, but they weren't called redcoats. somebody starts daring the redcoats to fire on them. You know, when they point the gun, they finally say, fine, I dare you, fire on me then. If you're really going to do this, just fire. Well, with all of the commotion and the emotions involved, someone thought that the actual order had been given to fire, that it was their commander that had ordered them to fire. And so they discharged their muskets, killing several people. And it is an event we call the Boston Massacre. Now, an objective look at what happened is that, would conclude that the British were doing everything possible to be restrained. These were not just a bunch of brutal British who singled out a group of nice people walking home from church and just, shot them dead in the street like dogs. As a matter of fact, the soldiers were allowed to be put on trial in an American court. The military was so angry at the soldiers for having fired on the crowd that they allowed an American court to try them, and they were found not guilty in an American court. Their lawyer was John Adams, the future president, and no other lawyer in Boston would defend the soldiers, but John Adams insisted that someone's got to do it, so he took the job pro bono for free, and he actually successfully defended the soldiers in the court. And he was able to demonstrate that the soldiers were not ordered to fire by their own commander because the commander was standing in front of them. And you wouldn't order your men to fire if your back is to them. You would be behind them. And so he was able to demonstrate that when it really gets down to it, these soldiers thought they were doing their duty. And of course, rocks were being hurled at him, and an American court agreed. Well, this is not how it was spun. All across the colonies, the story of the Boston Massacre emerged. And by the way, you can see in this picture the guys behind them. This picture is inaccurate. All across the colonies, it was the brutal British had finally attacked these perfectly nice people, and it angered the American colonists who did not understand the real story. At this same time, Parliament repeals the Townshend Acts. Parliament repeals the Townshend Acts because they weren't really being paid anyway, and the resistance was too bad, and we don't want any more Boston massacres on our hands. And that leads us to the East India Company. That leads us to the East India Company. You see, the British East India Company was one of the largest corporations in the world. It was by far the largest and most profitable British business, and for decades it had made a lot of people very, very wealthy. But in 1773, the East India Company was having financial difficulty. It was teetering on the verge of insolvency. And it was a company that was too big to fail. There was just too much of the British economy rested on the East India Company. And so Parliament decided to act in a way to save the company. Parliament decided to act in a way to save the company. And it did this by giving the East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade in North America. All the tea is going to be East India Company tea. It also changed some of the rules in terms of how the ships can travel, making it faster for the tea to get to the colonies. And actually, by most accounts, tea would have remained the same price or even gotten cheaper as a result. That was not good enough for the Americans. This was just another act of tyranny by taking away the competition, by forcing the Americans to buy one company's tea. This is an example of how the American people have no say in their own governance. If we were in Parliament, we would have had a say in this. If we were in Parliament, we would have had a voice in how this works. This is being imposed on us by the crown. And if you think, what's the big deal? It's just a bunch of tea. I mean, I agree, right? Pardon me while I drink a little tea. The Americans drink a lot of tea at this time. Americans drink a lot of tea at this time. Well, Sam Adams, again, in Boston, because all the troublemakers come from Boston, they tend to cheat a lot, right? They spy on the other football team, and, Bill Belichick really needs to get his act together. But nevertheless, in 1773, Samuel Adams and a group of his followers, after no doubt drinking a little bit, decided to make a statement. And so they dressed up as Indians, which everybody knew they weren't, boarded an East India ship, and threw all the tea overboard in Boston Harbor. Now, this was not a lot of tea in the grand scheme of things. It was just a drop in the bucket when it comes to production. It gained the nickname the Boston Tea Party. It gained the nickname the Boston Tea Party. An outright act of defiance against the tyranny of Parliament. Of course, people are still angry about the Boston Massacre. Across the colonies, a number of other similar tea parties took place. In a few other places, East India ships were boarded and the tea was dumped overboard. And Parliament was furious. Even though this wasn't a big economic loss, this is wanton destruction of private property. This is taking a further step across this line. This is a level of defiance that has never been done before. And Parliament wasn't going to have it. We can debate all day long whether or not you really are fairly represented in Parliament and what these taxes really mean, but the minute you start destroying private property is the minute we're drawing the line. That's the way Parliament looked at it. There was no sympathy. And so Parliament passed in the spring of 1774 the Coercive Acts, which the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. And these were designed to punish Boston. There's just no other way around it. The point was to teach the people of Boston a lesson. And the Coercive Acts had 2 or 3 key elements to them. Number 1, all self-rule is now dissolved. We've mentioned in an earlier lecture, Parliament will allow the American people to sort of govern themselves with their own assemblies as long as they play by the rules. That is now gone. Massachusetts will be ruled by a royal governor, and that's it. But the real problem here is that it closed the port of Boston until further notice. Boston is now shut down. And this destroys the Massachusetts economy. Goods cannot come in, they cannot go out. This causes widespread unemployment. Overnight, prosperous people suddenly saw their income just go away. And the people of Boston did not respond with more loyalty to the crown. It only made them even angrier, as you can imagine. Now, there's a third part about this. This was not meant to be a big part, but kind of like the Boston Massacre, this is going to be spun into something that it really isn't. You see, we're now going to send a heck of a lot more British regulars to patrol the streets. We can almost certainly expect demonstrations and likely violence towards anybody representing the crown in Boston. And so, also, these included, the Coercive Acts included the Quartering Act. It included the Quartering Act. Let me explain this to you real quick. soldiers would have to stay somewhere. If the militiamen muster and they do their spring training and their fall training, or if other soldiers are in the town or in the community, they got to stay somewhere. They got to sleep somewhere. And the most logical place for them to sleep is, of course, in open fields, in tents. There are no barracks at this time to speak of. And so what would happen is the soldiers would show up, they would pitch their tents, they would have their encampments, and that's where they would stay. Well, what happens if the weather is bad? What happens if it's really cold or if it's raining really hard? The tradition was, of course, that local businesses, taverns and shops and whatever would open their doors and allow soldiers to sleep inside out of the elements, and it was just a normal thing to do. Well, when these are the local Massachusetts militia mustering or whatever, this is not a problem, but everyone was rather loath to allow the redcoats, the British regulars, to sleep in their shops and their taverns when it was bad weather. I mean, we hate these guys, and it's just wonderful to see them outside, in the middle of a rainstorm, getting soaked and being miserable, because we hate these guys anyway. And this had become a problem. And so the Quartering Act passed the law that if the weather is bad and if it is necessary, shops and taverns and other buildings in town must open their doors to soldiers to protect them from bad weather. And if all of the shops and other places in town are full, soldiers are allowed to sleep in barns and outbuildings of local farmers, again, to protect them from the elements. Any sleeping in private businesses must involve compensation. If British soldiers sleep in somebody's barn, the farmer has to be paid for it. If they sleep in your tavern, you have to be paid for it. You get the idea. They don't stay for free. You will be compensated for it. And it's purely for the safety and security and well-being of the soldiers. Now, this isn't unreasonable, but like the Boston Massacre, this was spun into something that it was not. These terrible British soldiers are going into people's bedrooms and throwing them out and sleeping in their own beds, that sort of thing, which of course turned out to not be true. But it sounded good, and it was great if you don't like the British, and it's easy to believe if you're looking to believe it. The intolerable acts were a spark that angered people all across the colonies. Boston is sympathized with by everybody, because everybody understands when you close the ports to these colonies, you destroy those colonial economies. And it angers a lot of people. It is tyranny in action. It is exactly what a tyrant does when we push back against unfair laws. In September of 1774, members of the various colonies met in the First Continental Congress. They formed their own legislature to come up with a collective voice against what the Crown was doing. And the people you've heard of were, of course, there. Samuel Adams was certainly there. John Adams, the future president, was, of course, there. Our old friend George was there. You get the idea. Now, the Continental Congress in 1774 was not calling for revolution. It was not calling for revolt. They were not calling for breaking away from the Crown and forming their own country. That was in the back of their minds, but it was not something that they were calling for. They were actually trying to be rather tolerant. They toasted the king and, praised his health. But they did resolve that these acts violated the rights of the colonists. And they did resolve that the colonists deserve all of the same legal protections as their English counterparts. And that means, of course, no taxation without representation. If we are expected to pay taxes, you must find a way for us to sit in Parliament. The Continental Congress also agreed to form committees of safety, which would exist in the various cities to protect the rights of citizens. So in other words, groups that would push back against these laws. Now, these committees of safety were illegal. They were already against the rules. You can't form committees that are designed to push back against the authorities. But there is a genuine belief that violence is going to erupt. There's going to be more fighting if a resolution is not made. And we don't see the Crown budging at all. We don't see Parliament backing down on any of this. If anything, it's getting worse. Local militias start mustering more, and they start accumulating their guns and start thinking in terms of, what are we going to do if these people start fighting us? Who would we elect as our captain? Who would pay for it? That sort of stuff. And there is a general belief that in the event that we actually do start fighting the British regulars, if there is, actual fighting that starts taking place, we might be able to hold our own. There's a lot of optimism that, maybe we can, we're tough. We can handle this. We've been fighting Indians for a long time. A lot of us are veterans from the French and Indian War. There's not really a whole lot of British regulars here to begin with. We're not going to let ourselves get pushed around. And there's a lot more confidence than there probably should be in these local militia groups whenever they argue. We're going to push back if it comes down to it. In Massachusetts, the militia started calling themselves the Minutemen, with the idea that we can muster within a minute and be ready to fight anybody that's going after us. And the only people that would be, of course, the British regulars. The idea of organizing these militias, organizing these committees of safety, meeting with a Continental Congress, this is, of course, deeply disturbing to Parliament. And when Parliament figures out that these people are accumulating guns, these people are stacking their weapons and establishing arsenals, they mean business. And so what we have to think in terms of, if we're Parliament, is resolving this peacefully. And that's, of course, going to mean we got to disarm these guys. We got to disarm these militias. We have to take away the colonial ability to shoot guns at us. And that's going to lead to the first armed conflict, which we will, of course, talk about on Tuesday. All right, everyone, look, I hope everyone has a good day. Let me know if you have any questions, okay? I'm going to be posting the attendance link, and this lecture, of course, is going to be up for any of y'all that want to see it again. Okay, sound good? Any questions before we leave? All right, y'all take care.